Well, my name is Alex Monet. I'm the Chief Security and Privacy Officer at Georgian Partners. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about trust, specifically how to leverage customer trust to build business value. Now, I don't want to try to boil the ocean here because trust is a really, really big topic. It's a topic that covers a lot of different things. It covers security, it covers privacy, it covers many different topics. So what I want to do today is kind of talk about trust from a 10,000-foot view. We're going to dig in and start building a framework for trust. In other words, how should we be thinking about trust as a business? And how do we ultimately leverage that trust to build real business value? Before we do that, a little bit of background on myself. I've spent my entire career working in cybersecurity. Graduated with a degree in systems engineering, and I immediately actually started working for BlackBerry. Now, as most of you know, BlackBerry is a business and a brand that has built itself around trust. So back in 2006, I was actually BlackBerry's very first product manager within its cybersecurity division. I actually ended up staying there and working there for 12 years. And so during those 12 years, I obviously got to see a lot of shifts in BlackBerry's business and a lot of shifts in the way that people think about trust. Over the years, I started off as a product manager, then I went to become a security researcher. I did security incident response. I basically held every single cybersecurity hat you can imagine. And by the end, I actually became BlackBerry's chief security officer. And so as chief security officer, what I got to do was really help the company transition itself from being a smartphone manufacturer to being an enterprise software and security company. Now, before we go any further, I always get questions about that photo. So a couple of years back, I was actually on a TV show called Canada's Smartest Person. And one of the things that I got to do, which was really cool, is basically experience what it's like to be backstage at a show like this. So for those who have never heard of the show, think of it kind of like Jeopardy, but instead of doing trivia, you're basically doing kind of IQ tests. So this particular one was a really interesting one. It was called Spin a Speech. What you do is you go out on stage and you spin a little wheel, and whatever it lands on, you have to give a speech on that. So in this case, you can see the wheel landed on breakup. I ended up having to give a breakup speech with the host of the show. Not only that, but you get to put on, they put on basically a list of words that you have to use. So they have a list of 30 words that you have to use. You've never seen these words before. And you're supposed to basically make up this speech in real time and try to break up with the host using those words. Now, if that doesn't sound scary enough, imagine you're mic'd up, you've got like 7 HD cameras on you, and you know you're going to be on national television on this. It was the scariest thing I have ever done in my life, and I actually like to use it as motivation because basically no matter what happens in my life, nothing will ever be this scary. So about a year ago, I joined a company called Georgian Partners. Now, how many of you here have heard of Georgian Partners? I got one little woo there, and about 5 or 6, maybe 10 hands. So for those of you who don't know Georgian Partners, we are an investment firm based out of Toronto, Canada. And we invest along 3 what we call thesis areas, which are basically areas that we believe are fundamentally changing business. The first one is around applied artificial intelligence. The second one is around conversational business. And the third one is around security, privacy, and trust. And one of the companies that we have invested in is actually Telium. And a big part of the reason why we invested in Telium is we feel they really differentiate on trust. We feel this is actually one of their strongest areas. Now, the other thing that we do at Georgian, which is a little different, is we actually do applied research with our portfolio companies. So we research things like differential privacy and transfer learning. We have our own development team. We have our own software engineering team that mirrors the software engineering teams of our portfolio companies. So for instance, I'm chief security officer, we have a CTO, we have a director of engineering, we have a director of product management. And so what we're able to do is work alongside with our portfolio companies to help them build things like trust. Now let's talk a little bit about trust and kind of talk from a 10,000-foot level in terms of what it means. Trust is kind of one of these things that we all know intrinsically. We all understand intrinsically because they're part of what makes us human. So every single time we meet somebody new, one of the key questions that we need to figure out is, should we trust them? And it's a really tough question to answer because ultimately we don't know a whole lot about their background. We haven't had a lot of experience with them. Now, imagine taking this and applying it to a company. How do you figure out whether you should trust the company that you're doing business with, which by definition is made up of lots of people, some of whom are more trustworthy than others? Well, the answer here is obviously you can't go through every single person and try to figure out whether to trust them. So you ultimately need to figure out whether to trust the company based on their brand. There are certain brands and certain companies that we intrinsically trust. I'll use the example of Starbucks, right? If you want to go out pretty much anywhere in the world and find a slightly better than average and much higher than average price latte, you're going to go to Starbucks, right? Because you trust them. You know what they're going to taste like. And what's interesting about Starbucks, and most of the examples I'm going to give, is they generate direct business value through trust. Think about it this way. Imagine you are somewhere halfway around the world. You're in Dubai, let's say. And you have the choice of going to Starbucks and getting the same thing you always get back home, which is your $5 venti vanilla latte with 3 shots of syrup. Or you can go to the local coffee shop and get pretty much the same thing for $3. What are you going to do? Most of us, we're going to go to Starbucks and pay $5 for that latte. Well, the extra $2 that we're paying to Starbucks, that's ultimately the trust premium. It's the trust premium that we're paying to Starbucks because we know exactly what that coffee is going to taste like. I can give you lots of other examples. Coca-Cola is another great one. Walt Disney is another big one. Lots of companies are ultimately building a lot of value through trust. The challenge we're having right now is a lot of software companies are not doing that. Or I should say a lot of software companies really haven't done that for the past 10 years. And it's led to this crisis of trust, where we're seeing, customers are seeing nonstop stories in the media about data breaches, about privacy issues, about hacks, about malware, about ransomware. And so they don't really know who to trust anymore. And so what's happening is these customers, their expectations are evolving. Before it was basically, I'm going to give you my data and I'm going to trust you until proven otherwise. Now it's very much more of a trust but verify type of model. And I see a lot of nods in the room, so it sounds like you guys are all experiencing this within your own businesses. There's a huge amount of impact of broken trust. A study was done a couple years back that looked at companies that had a public breach. They actually underperformed the NASDAQ by 16% over 3 years. That's literally billions of dollars of business value going out the window. There's also some pretty funny examples of companies that have tried to do trust and haven't done it very well. How many of you here are familiar with the Microsoft Tay chatbot? I see a couple hands, and I see a gentleman over there that's kind of laughing and shaking his head, so he clearly knows the full story here. So for those of you who don't know, Microsoft Tay was a chatbot that Microsoft tried to put together, and the basic idea of this chatbot was it was an AI-powered chatbot that would actually chat with people and make them feel better about themselves, make them feel better about whatever was going on in their lives. But what was cool about this, and I put cool in quotation marks, is that it was AI-driven, so it would automatically start speaking to the person in the same way that they spoke to them. Now, in a lab environment, you can imagine this was totally fine and totally successful. Hi, how are you doing? I'm doing well. Thank you, Tay. When they put this on Twitter, if you've ever been on Twitter, you know that's not really the way people talk. So what happened was the Twitter trolls took over and decided to start swearing at Tay, to start saying misogynistic and racist things to Tay. And of course, Tay did exactly what it was programmed to do, which was start swearing and saying misogynistic and racist things back to the users. This was obviously a bit of a black eye on Microsoft. Lots of other examples. The other example I like to use is Watson. IBM is really pushing Watson as a way to improve healthcare, a way to help diagnose new types of diseases and to be more effective than doctors. And in some ways, it might actually be more effective than doctors, but the problem is we don't necessarily know that, and we can't trust it because we don't understand how it actually comes to the conclusion. That's one of the big challenges with artificial intelligence, is you kind of start getting into these black box type of scenarios where you're putting in a bunch of inputs, but unlike a traditional deterministic type of program where you can follow the flow of the program, if you have, let's say, a complex neural network, you don't necessarily know how it's processing those inputs and how it's coming out with those outputs. And in a situation like, let's say, Netflix, for instance, where Netflix is recommending a movie to you and you're not really interested in that movie, it's not the end of the world. You don't really care why it is that Netflix was wrong on that. But if you have a situation where something is telling you that you have cancer or you potentially have cancer, doctors and patients want to know, well, how the heck did it come to that conclusion? Another simple example here is self-driving cars. One of the great myths about self-driving cars is that they're not ready for prime time yet because they're not as good at driving, as good as humans at driving. The reality is, if you look at the actual numbers, self-driving cars are actually better than us at driving right now. They get into fewer accidents, they drive more safely. The reason why we don't trust self-driving cars, the reason why they're not on the road today, is because we don't know how they make those decisions. And so when you have a situation like the Tesla incident that happened a few years back, where a self-driving car gets into an accident, we freak out. Because think about it, literally when you're stepping in a self-driving car, you're taking your hands off the wheel and you're putting your life in the hands of an algorithm. And if you don't understand how that algorithm works, that's really scary. But I don't want to sit here as kind of the big bad security guy and scare everyone, because I think if you think about trust as just a way of protecting your business, a way of protecting your existing assets, you're missing the boat, and I think you're kind of missing the point. When I look at trust, trust is not just a way of protecting what you have today. It's actually a way of building new business and attracting new customers and getting them to give you more data and more revenue. And I want to give you some specific examples here of businesses that have built real measurable business value with trust. We're going to start with the way people normally think about trust, which is security and privacy. Microsoft is a great example of a business that has ultimately turned around its business with regards to trust. If you remember Microsoft back in the late 1990s, it was a mess. Like, Windows itself was a mess in terms of all the viruses, all the issues on it. You had Internet Explorer, which constantly had you doing drive-by downloads, JavaScript issues, all sorts of stuff like that. Microsoft realized that, and Microsoft realized that if they are going to win back their core enterprise customers, they're going to have to build a lot of trust. So they actually invested a lot in trust. They created a Microsoft Trust Center. They invested a lot in cybersecurity teams. They invested a lot in penetration testing. And if you look at Microsoft today, Microsoft's actually one of the most trusted business brands. Now, arguably the only brand more trusted than Microsoft right now is Apple. And Apple has built trust in a very different way than Microsoft has, because Microsoft's pedigree has always been about the enterprise. Here's why the enterprise should trust us. Here's our enterprise software solutions. Apple has always come at it from a consumer standpoint. And Apple has decided to take more of a privacy type of angle to trust. You even look at kind of their latest iPhone commercials, they're all about iPhone privacy. iPhone equals privacy. That's how they're ultimately trying to differentiate themselves from Android. One of the neat things about Apple is, and I believe this wholeheartedly, they have the greatest marketing and PR team in the world. I mean, they are fantastically good at taking these extremely complex ideas of privacy and security and encryption and cryptography and distilling them down to where every single consumer can understand it. And that's a key lesson for trust. It's not about just building the plumbing for trust. You also have to market it the right way so your users understand it. I want to give a couple of examples of other types of companies that have built trust in different ways. I would argue one of the other most trusted brands out there is Amazon. And I don't think Amazon's trust has anything to do with their security or their privacy. It's all about reliability, right? Why do we shop on Amazon? It's because of the fact that we can reliably find the things that we want at the cheapest prices, and we know that they're going to be at our doorstep within a matter of days. And if we don't get what we want, they have a great return policy. They're very reliable. That's why we trust them. Why do we trust Whole Foods? Why do we pay more money than we should for food? Well, it's because of the fact that we feel that they're very transparent, right? We shop at Whole Foods because we feel like we have a better understanding by shopping at Whole Foods of where our food is coming from and what's going into our food. So how do you go about building trust within your own business and with your own customers? And I'll preface this by saying it's not easy, but what we're going to try to do here is build a quick model of how trust needs to be built. And in order to understand this, there's kind of two key aspects of trust. There's the value. This is your core business proposition, right? Why do customers use your product? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I think every single one of us here is an expert on value. That's what we're good at. That's what we do. That's why we run our businesses. What I want to focus on is this other aspect of comfort, which is basically the peace of mind. When customers give you their data, what makes them comfortable that you're going to use it in the right way? And so what we've done at Georgian is we've started looking at it in terms of a risk matrix. So the more value you deliver to your customers and the more comfortable you make them, the more they're going to trust you. Now, if we look there on the bottom left-hand side, if you don't have any value and your customers are uncomfortable, you don't have a business, period. If you are delivering a relatively low amount of value, but your customers are very comfortable with you, that ultimately puts your business at risk. And I'm going to pick on BlackBerry here for a second, because I think BlackBerry is a shining example of this. If you look at BlackBerry and the reason why BlackBerry ultimately lost out to the Apples and Googles of the world in the consumer market, it's not because consumers weren't comfortable that BlackBerry was treating their data well, that it was storing their data well. It was ultimately 5 little syllables made up by Apple. There's an app for that, right? Because before that, before Steve Jobs came in and said there's an app for that, no one was thinking about apps. If you think about it way back in the day, everybody was thinking in terms of email, in terms of security, in terms of privacy. Those were the key things. But Steve Jobs understood that he couldn't beat BlackBerry in email, so he came in and said, okay, I'm going to change the battlefield. And now the battlefield is apps. And oh, by the way, we have a huge lead on apps. Isn't this great? So Apple was able to create more value, and even though the customers weren't as comfortable giving their data to Apple, they still went and bought iPhones and bought Android devices because they were getting so much more value. I would argue a lot of businesses these days are at the upper left corner of that matrix. They're delivering a high amount of value, but there's a lot of cost to the customers. And so when you're ultimately delivering a lot of value, but you can't protect the customer's data, that can cause a huge amount of problems in the long run. And those problems aren't always going to start early on, but once your business scales to a certain size, hackers are going to start targeting you. This is one of the single biggest mistakes that I see entrepreneurs make, is they basically start off with small businesses, and they start off with this concept of, well, I'm small enough that no hacker is going to target me anyways, right? At worst, I'm going to be collateral damage from a big hack that's going to affect a lot of the bigger players, but no one's going to target me. Well, I can tell you from experience, once your business crosses a certain threshold, once you've hit that tipping point, once your business is big enough, popular enough, and has enough important data, hackers will start targeting you. And once that threshold happens, if you haven't built your architecture the right way, if you haven't built your trust the right way, you're ultimately going to have to re-architect your entire platform, which can take months, if not years. And that's not a choice, by the way. That's something you have to do. That's something Microsoft had to do. That's something BlackBerry had to do. That's something most large businesses had to do. My advice to you is if you're planning to scale your business to that tipping point, build trust in right from the beginning so you don't have to re-architect. So how do we actually do that? How do we build comfort with our customers? And this is probably the most important slide and kind of the key takeaway here. This is a framework that we've built at Georgian Partners and that we've worked with our portfolio companies on, including Telium, to really help deploy and really help them understand how to build trust with their customers. And the best way to think about this is think about it as kind of like a house. At the very bottom of the house, the foundation of the house is accountability. You need to have the right level of accountability within the organization when it comes to trust. That, in my opinion, that needs to go up to the CEO and that needs to go up to the board of directors. If the job of trust is, if a junior IT analyst is ultimately responsible for trust, that's not going to work in the long run. On top of that, you have to have security. Security is basically the basic architectural building block of trust. You have to have data at rest encryption, data in transit encryption. You have to have the right types of authentication. You have to have DDoS attack mitigation, all those sorts of things. If you don't have accountability and security, nothing on top of it matters. You can have the world's greatest privacy policy. If you get hacked, it doesn't matter. Privacy is another big one. I don't think I need to talk too much about this one. The one comment I will make on privacy is very different in the context of a consumer versus a business. When a consumer thinks about their privacy, they're mostly thinking about, can my friends and family see this information? Can random strangers see the information? And in some cases, can the government see the information? When businesses think about privacy, usually the conversation comes down to competitors. And this is where you need to start thinking about privacy from your own business, is if if you're collecting data from 2 different businesses and those 2 different businesses are competing with each other, you need to be very, very careful that that data is separated, because as soon as you have any sort of data leak between that wall, that's where you're going to lose both of those customers. I think the most underappreciated part of privacy, and the one I want to spend a bit of time on, is transparency. One of the things that we often get stuck in as businesses is we get stuck in the old world of thinking, which is basically security through obscurity. I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to that have basically said, well, I can't tell you that, Alex, because that's proprietary information. Really? The way you encrypt your data, the way that you do your security architecture, the way you authenticate your users is private information? And they've built their entire security mindset on this. It's basically, oh, well, we can't let the hackers find out how we do our security, because if they do, they might hack us. I'll tell you right now, from having worked with hackers and from having been a hacker myself, that mindset does not work. My advice to you is, rather than taking the most common approach, which is basically, why should we reveal that information? Why should we give it to our customers? Start thinking about it the other way. Start thinking about, well, why should I not give my customers this? What am I actually gaining by not giving my customers this? And I'm not saying you should suddenly take all your internal information and give it to your customers, but the more information that you give to your customers, especially around how you do your security, how you do your privacy, and how you have your corporate accountability, the more comfortable it's going to make them, and the more it's going to make them trust you. And finally, you have fairness, which is really around making sure that you understand how you're processing data and how you're potentially introducing biases and how you can potentially take out those types of biases. And of course, reliability ultimately comes down to making sure that we give the results that we said we would deliver to our customers. I want to do a quick case study on building customer trust. This one's going to be super quick, but I like this one because it's a really neat example of how trust can have nothing to do with security and privacy. So Turnitin is a soon-to-be former Georgian company, and I'll explain why in a second. How many of you have kids who are in high school or university? Okay, so chances are you probably haven't heard of Turnitin, but chances are your kids have. So Turnitin is actually an anti-cheating mechanism that essentially what it does is it takes, when your child turns in an essay, for instance, it takes that and it compares it against similar types of essays on the internet. Now, the simplest way to cheat, obviously, is to copy-paste something from a website. That's not a very advanced way to cheat. That's obviously going to be detected fairly easily. So what's happened now is more and more people are doing what's called contract cheating, which is rather than copying and pasting something existing, what they do is they outsource it typically to somebody from another country who writes their essay for them. So it's a completely new and unique essay, just not written by the person. And so what Turnitin had to do was they had to build their own natural language processing algorithms to start detecting this type of stuff. And the reason they were able to do this is because each of us talks in a very specific way, and the way we talk is the way we write. We use certain grammar structures, we use certain words, we use contractions, or we don't use contractions. Now, what Turnitin found was that there was actually some bias being introduced here towards or against certain types of students, certain subpopulations. So there might be biases based on the student's gender, there might be biases based on their education, biases based on their age. What do you think the biggest source of bias was? Does anyone have any guesses? The biggest source of bias was actually their native language. If they were English native speakers, or if they were not English native speakers, non-English native speakers would naturally write in different ways. And unfortunately, non-English native speakers were getting flagged more often than English native speakers for contract cheating, even in situations where they weren't actually cheating. So what we did was we actually worked with them to implement anti-bias algorithms within their artificial intelligence mechanisms to start reducing that and to basically make sure that we didn't have those types of biases introduced within those types of systems. I mentioned before that Turnitin is a soon-to-be former Georgia company. The reason is because they recently got acquired for about 1.7 billion US. We're obviously fairly happy with that outcome. The challenge for us is how do we actually measure the value of what we built here? This is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to trust is how do you measure it? So one of the things to keep in mind when you're trying to measure trust is it doesn't always have to be kind of a direct number in terms of, well, we built this trust with this business, therefore it created $200 million in value. But the more that you can start to think about how you assign those numbers, and the more you can kind of estimate those numbers, the easier it's going to be to pitch that trust to the executives. Because the challenge that we often face with trust is essentially helping our executives understand the value of trust. And the more that we can start putting numbers behind that, the more effective we're going to be. I want to leave you with a couple quotes from people much richer than me. This is a quote from Tim Cook from Apple. He started talking about how a lot of businesses these days are lulling their customers into complacency about their personal information. This is shots fired right here. I mean, this is a direct shot at the Amazons and Googles of the world. The way Apple's thinking about trust is they're thinking about it in terms of, well, all these other businesses have to collect data. We don't have to collect data because we're a hardware company. And so by its nature, Apple can actually build more trust with their users because of the fact that they don't need to take their users' data and directly translate it into business value. The last one here is from Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce. I really like this one because I think it really kind of summarizes the way that trust has evolved. When you think about trust over the past 2 decades, or when you think about technology, technology's always been the most important thing. It's always been about the idea. Who has the best idea? Who can deliver the best value for their customers? What he's noticing is what I'm trying to point out and what hopefully all of you are noticing within your businesses, which is that more and more business success and business value doesn't just come from value, it comes from value and comfort, which is ultimately about trust. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and happy to take some questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. Really appreciate that. I think it's interesting when I think your framework for how to build comfort, even the idea of comfort and trust being so closely linked, I think is quite interesting. For those of us in the room that maybe are not necessarily leading an organization, but are maybe leading groups, or maybe we're in the data side of the house, and we are inspired by this idea. How do you build trust, or can you build trust from one group, one idea, one champion, and allow that to spread inside of organizations? Or what advice would you have for that? So
in my experience, I've always been very lucky to work for organizations and CEOs that fundamentally understood trust. And what I will say is if your CEO doesn't understand trust, you need to sit down with him or her and help to explain to them why trust is important, because ultimately if they don't, you're going to have a lot of trouble driving that from the ground up. I've tried it myself, it doesn't work.
Has to be in the culture. So CCPA is a current thing that we're talking about right after we just looked at the 1 year plus since the GDPR came into force. We often find ourselves getting caught up in the idea of regulatory compliance, focusing on the law, focusing on what I need to do from a checklist standpoint to make sure that I'm on the right side of this and I'm doing what's right by the deadline.
Yep.
Is that the right way to think about this? Because I think that's where we can maybe get a higher calling of what we should be doing here that maybe makes some of those checklists a little bit easier?
Yeah, so I've worked with regulators around the world on things like CCPA and GDPR and all sorts of privacy and security laws. What I can tell you from working with these regulators, they have a really tough job because they're always one step behind. They're always struggling to catch up with our technology and catch up with what we're building. My advice to you is regulatory compliance is a great starting point and a really terrible endpoint when it comes to building trust. What I would ultimately do is look at building your own trust architecture that makes sense within the context of your business. Chances are once you do that, you're going to find you're already complying with 95% of the regulations. The 5% of regulations that you're not complying with, my advice to you is build relationships with those regulators and help to explain to them why it is that you're ultimately meeting the spirit of what they're asking for, not necessarily the letter of what they're asking for. And if you have those good relationships, you'll be surprised how often the regulators will actually be willing to create a dialogue with you around that.
think it's interesting, a lot of this was echoed in the Gap presentation before you as well. It's when you start to see the commonalities here and obviously the trends of where consumers want us to go, these things start to make a lot more sense as something that I can comply with or really excel at.
Yep.
You mentioned also, I think it was a NASDAQ stat that you had about the loss in valuation of companies or market cap. Do you think a lot of this is voting or consciously consumers voting with their wallets on where they want to spend their energy? Is it I'm patronizing those more that I trust and I have comfort in? Am I penalizing the others, or am I just moving and shifting my focus?
No, I think you absolutely are penalizing the others, and I think you absolutely are moving and shifting your focus. I think, I'll give the example of BlackBerry, for instance. Why is BlackBerry still alive today? BlackBerry's still alive because people ultimately trusted BlackBerry. And even when nobody wanted our phones anymore, even when everybody would come to us and basically say, well, we're full of iPhones and Androids, they still came to us and said, we want you to manage those devices because we trust you. So seeing that kind of fundamental shift from businesses and from consumers was really interesting, and I think that's just going to continue rolling on.
I will say I do miss the keyboard sometimes. So, there are some things that are hard to let go of. Alex, thank you very much for taking the time today. Really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.